December 3, 1993, 2:47 p.m. Carlos Lehder stepped out of a bulletproof Mercedes in front of Jardines Montesacro Cemetery, carrying a black leather briefcase that contained exactly $500,000 in U.S. hundreds, and every sicario, cartel boss, and DEA agent watching the funeral instantly understood that something had shifted in Colombia's power structure. Carlos had been locked in a U.S. federal prison in Pennsylvania for the past 6 years. Extradited, sentenced to life plus 135 years, buried so deep in American custody that everyone assumed he'd die there. Yet here he was, walking through Medellín in broad daylight, wearing a custom suit that still smelled like American dry cleaning, surrounded by 4 bodyguards nobody recognized. The funeral crowd, over 3,000 people mourning Pablo Escobar, parted as Carlos walked toward the casket. His face showed no emotion, just the calculated emptiness of someone who'd spent 6 years planning this exact moment. Behind him, Colombian National Police officers stood frozen, radios in hand, waiting for orders that weren't coming because someone very high up had made a phone call telling them to stand down. Carlos reached the casket, placed the briefcase on top of it, and said 9 words loud enough for the front rows to hear. "For your family, and for everyone watching this." Then he turned and walked back to the Mercedes, moving through a crowd that suddenly realized the game they thought had ended with Pablo's death yesterday had actually just entered a new phase nobody had planned for. Carlos Lehder shouldn't have existed outside a U.S. federal prison in 1993, which made his presence at Pablo Escobar's funeral the most significant power move in Colombian cartel history. Carlos had been Pablo's partner in the early days, the logistics genius who'd pioneered using Norman's Cay in the Bahamas as a cocaine transshipment point. Between 1978 and 1982, Carlos and Pablo had moved thousands of kilos through that island, making billions. But by the mid-1980s, their partnership fractured. Carlos was erratic, increasingly paranoid, obsessed with politics and Nazi ideology that embarrassed the pragmatic cartel bosses. In 1987, the Colombian government, pressured by the U.S., arrested Carlos and extradited him. Everyone assumed that was the end. Life plus 135 years meant Carlos would die in American custody. The Medellín cartel continued without him. Pablo became the face of Colombian cocaine. Carlos became a footnote, a cautionary tale about what happened when you got too visible, too strange, too American-facing. Except Carlos had spent 6 years in federal prison doing something nobody expected. He'd been talking. Not testifying publicly, that would have been too obvious, but providing intelligence to DEA handlers, FBI agents, people who understood that Carlos Lehder's knowledge of cartel operations, money laundering networks, and corrupt officials was worth more than keeping him locked up forever. Some historians argue Carlos cut a deal immediately after extradition, that his cooperation started in 1987 and continued for 6 years. Others claim he held out until 1991, after Manuel Noriega's arrest showed that even protected dictators could fall, and Carlos decided his best survival strategy was becoming useful to American intelligence. Either way, by late 1993, Carlos had traded enough information that certain people in the U.S. government decided he could be useful outside prison. When Pablo Escobar was killed on December 2, 1993, Carlos Lehder was in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. By December 3rd, he was on a private plane to Colombia with a briefcase full of cash and instructions to deliver a message that would reshape how everyone understood post-Pablo power dynamics. The briefcase Carlos Lehder placed on Pablo Escobar's casket contained money, but it represented something far more valuable: legitimacy. Pablo's family, his wife Maria, Victoria, his children, his mother, were in desperate financial straits. Pablo had been hunted for 18 months, his properties were seized, his cash reserves depleted. The family was surviving on whatever loyal associates could provide, which wasn't much because everyone was scrambling for position in the power vacuum Pablo's death created. $500,000 was a fortune to a family suddenly without resources, but more importantly, it was a public declaration. Carlos was saying, I'm still relevant. I still have access to money. I still have power. And I'm choosing to support Pablo's family when everyone else is calculating whether abandoning them makes more strategic sense. The funeral crowd understood this immediately. Because if Carlos Lehder, locked in American federal prison for 6 years, could walk into Medellín with $500,000 in bodyguards and immunity from arrest, that meant Carlos had backing from someone powerful enough to override Colombian law enforcement. Some people whispered it was the CIA, that Carlos had become an American intelligence asset, and this was his coming out party. Others claimed it was the Cali cartel, that they'd somehow arranged Carlos's release to create chaos in Medellín. Still others believed Carlos had kept hidden resources from his Norman's Cay days and was operating independently. The truth was probably a combination. Carlos had traded intelligence to the Americans, yes, but he'd also maintained connections in Colombia through proxies, and the briefcase full of cash, delivered at Pablo's funeral in front of 3,000 witnesses, was Carlos announcing he was back in the game, and everyone needed to recalculate who had power and who didn't. The 3,000 people at Pablo Escobar's funeral on December 3, 1993, represented every faction in Colombian organized crime, and each of them processed Carlos Lehder's appearance differently. Pablo's family received the briefcase with visible relief. Maria Victoria, Pablo's widow, was crying, part grief for her dead husband, part stress about how she'd survive and protect her children. The $500,000 meant immediate security. More importantly, it meant someone powerful still acknowledged the Escobar name had value. The remaining Medellín cartel leadership, people like Popeye and La Kika, who'd survived the search block manhunt, watched Carlos with suspicion. They'd spent 6 years building operations without him. His sudden return suggested American backing, which meant he couldn't be trusted. But the money was real, and money bought loyalty. If Carlos was working with Americans but still supporting Pablo's family, that created complicated calculations about whether to treat him as ally or enemy. The Cali cartel representatives, and they were there, watching from a distance, saw opportunity. Carlos's return meant instability in Medellín. Instability meant openings for Cali to expand. If they could recruit Carlos, turn him into an asset against what remained of Medellín operations, the power balance would shift dramatically. DEA agents observing the funeral, they were definitely there, photographing attendees, saw something that probably made their careers complicated. A man they'd helped imprison was now walking free in Colombia, clearly with some kind of official protection, delivering drug money to a drug lord's widow. That wasn't standard DEA procedure. It suggested parallel operations, CIA, State Department, someone operating above DEA's authority. Colombian National Police, the ones who'd spent 18 months hunting Pablo and finally killed him yesterday, stood paralyzed. They had arrest warrants for Carlos Lehder, but orders from above, exactly who gave those orders remained classified for decades, told them to stand down, to watch but not engage. That powerlessness in front of 3,000 cartel members and associates sent a message about who really controlled Colombia. For your family, and for everyone watching this. Those 9 words Carlos Lehder spoke at Pablo's casket contained layers of meaning that everyone in Colombia's underworld spent years unpacking. On the surface, charitable gesture, supporting a fallen partner's family. Noble in cartel terms. But the second half, and for everyone watching this, transformed charity into threat. Carlos was saying, "This money proves I have resources. It proves I have protection. It proves I can operate openly while you're all still hiding. Calculate accordingly." The everyone watching included multiple audiences, Colombian cartels trying to figure out post-Pablo power structures, American law enforcement trying to understand how their prisoner had become a free man, Colombian government officials trying to determine whether Carlos represented a new threat or a useful tool. Each audience heard different implications in those 9 words. Some historians argue Carlos was announcing his intention to rebuild operations in Colombia, that the $500,000 was seed money for recruiting from Pablo's fractured organization. Others claim Carlos was actually working for American intelligence, that the briefcase was a message to other cartel bosses. Cooperate with Americans like I did, and you can have freedom and money too. Still others believe Carlos was playing all sides, Americans, Cali, Medellín remnants, building leverage to create his own independent position. What's documented is what happened in the months following December 3, 1993. Carlos didn't disappear back to American custody. He remained in Colombia, publicly visible, conducting business nobody could quite define. Some meetings with former Medellín associates, some meetings with people connected to Cali, some meetings with Colombian officials, all of it somehow legal, somehow protected, somehow impossible, but happening anyway. Carlos Lehder's activities between December 1993 and mid-1995, when he vanished from public view again, remain one of Colombia's most enduring mysteries. He wasn't arrested despite multiple active warrants. He wasn't killed despite being vulnerable to rival cartels. He operated openly in Medellín, Bogotá, sometimes Cali, always with bodyguards, always with apparent immunity. The money kept flowing, not just the initial $500,000 to Pablo's family, but payments to other families whose members had died in Pablo's war, investments in businesses that looked legitimate on paper. Some investigative journalists claimed Carlos was CIA's asset, that American intelligence was using him to destabilize what remained of Colombian cartels from the inside. They pointed to how Colombian law enforcement never moved against him despite opportunities, suggesting American pressure was protecting him. Others argued Carlos was working for Cali, that they'd somehow arranged his early release through high-level corruption and were using him to recruit Medellín remnants. The evidence here was circumstantial. Carlos met with people who later joined Cali operations, but proving causation was impossible. A third theory suggested Carlos was actually cooperating with Colombian government forces, providing intelligence about cartel operations in exchange for freedom of movement. This would explain why national police didn't arrest him. He was more valuable free and talking than imprisoned and silent. The truth was probably all three simultaneously. Carlos Lehder had survived by being useful to multiple power structures at once, providing each one enough information or service to maintain protection, while never fully committing to any single patron. That kind of multi-party manipulation requires intelligence, paranoia, and willingness to betray anyone when necessary. What nobody could prove, what remains unproven 30 years later, is whether Carlos's appearance at Pablo's funeral was spontaneous or orchestrated by handlers. Did Carlos decide independently to deliver that briefcase, or was it theater staged by American intelligence to send messages to multiple audiences? The fact that we still don't know suggests Carlos succeeded at his primary goal, staying valuable and mysterious enough that killing him cost more than tolerating him. Carlos Lehder disappeared from public view in mid-1995 and resurfaced in U.S. custody in 1996, serving a drastically reduced sentence. His original sentence was life plus 135 years. When he returned to American custody, that was quietly reduced to 30 years. With time served and cooperation credit, he was released in 2020 and deported to Germany, where he held citizenship through his father. The man who'd pioneered Caribbean cocaine trafficking, who'd built Norman's Cay into a drug superhighway, who'd been sentenced to die in prison, walked free after 33 years. The official explanation was cooperation with authorities. But cooperation usually doesn't buy you freedom to walk around Colombia for 2 years, delivering briefcases full of cash to drug lords' widows. Something else happened, something involving levels of intelligence community coordination that remain classified. What's known is that multiple cartel operations were disrupted between 1993 and 1995. People Carlos met with were arrested months later. Money laundering networks Carlos had knowledge of were dismantled. The timing suggests Carlos's freedom came with a price. He provided intelligence that damaged his former colleagues while publicly appearing to support them. The funeral gesture, the $500,000, the public show of loyalty to Pablo's family, might have been the most cynical move in Carlos's career. It bought him credibility with cartel members who saw him as honorable. That credibility gave him access to information and people he then reported to his American handlers. The money he placed on Pablo's casket was an investment in betrayal. Carlos Lehder walking into Pablo Escobar's funeral with $500,000 became legend, because it revealed something fundamental about power in the post-Pablo era. The rules had changed, and nobody was sure who wrote the new ones. For decades, Colombian cartels operated with certain assumptions: get arrested, stay arrested; get extradited to the U.S., die in American custody; cross the Americans, face consequences. These were rules everyone understood, even if they didn't like them. Carlos's appearance at that funeral, impossible, protected, generous, threatening, shattered those assumptions. If Carlos could walk free after life plus 135, what did sentences mean anymore? If he could operate openly in Colombia despite warrants, what did sovereignty mean? If he could place drug money on a drug lord's casket while DEA watched and did nothing, what did law enforcement mean? The funeral became a recalculation point. Everyone in Colombian organized crime had to reassess who had real power, who could be trusted, what rules actually mattered. Some people saw opportunity. If Carlos could negotiate his way out, maybe others could too. Some saw warning. Carlos was clearly working for someone, and getting close to him meant exposure. Some saw confirmation that the game had become too complex, that the old certainties about cartels versus government had dissolved into something more ambiguous. Pablo Escobar died believing he could outlast everyone through violence and money. Carlos Lehder survived by understanding that information was more valuable than either. The briefcase he placed on Pablo's casket contained $500,000, but the real message was priceless. I know things you need. I have protection you don't understand. Calculate accordingly. The story of Carlos Lehder at Pablo Escobar's funeral is about a man who should have died in American prison, but walked free by making himself more valuable alive than dead. The $500,000 was theater. The real power was in who allowed that theater to happen. Carlos lives in Germany now, as of 2020, free, protected, quiet. The man who pioneered cocaine trafficking through the Caribbean, who helped build the Medellín cartel, who spent decades in custody, somehow survived by being useful enough to enough. Powerful people that killing him or keeping him locked up became less attractive than letting him fade into retirement. Next week, we're covering the day the Cali cartel surrendered to Colombian authorities and how their gentleman's approach to drug trafficking nearly worked before it spectacularly didn't. Drop a comment. Do you think Carlos was a genius, playing all sides, or a traitor who survived by betraying everyone? Let me know. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous person at a funeral isn't the one mourning. It's the one who shouldn't be alive to attend at all.